4 months. That's all it took for a marriage built on faith, witnessed by hundreds, and blessed from the pulpit to completely collapse. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but in full public view, with allegations that would shake an entire congregation to its core. This is the story of a pastor who preached the sanctity of marriage every Sunday morning, who built his ministry on traditional family values, who aligned his church with a political movement that claimed to stand for everything sacred in American life. And this is the story of the woman who married him, believed in him, and then did something that would change everything. She exposed him. Not with whispers, not with hints, but with a public declaration that sent shockwaves through Atlanta's religious community and beyond. Allegations of infidelity, claims of betrayal, a marriage that barely lasted a season. And here's what makes this story different from every other scandal you've heard. The pastor didn't deny it and quietly fade away. He didn't step down and seek redemption. He filed for divorce, immediately, publicly, as if that would somehow end the conversation. But it didn't end anything. It only raised more questions. Questions about power, about truth, about what really happens when the image of holiness collides with human failure, about who gets to tell their story and who gets silenced. This isn't just about one marriage falling apart. This is about what happens when faith becomes performance, when leadership becomes control, and when someone finally decides they've had enough of playing a role they never auditioned for. So what really happened inside that marriage? Why did it unravel so spectacularly fast? And why did exposure come before confession? The answers are more complicated than you think.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
Let's start with what everyone could see. The church sat in a prominent part of Atlanta, the kind of building you couldn't miss if you drove past it. Modern, well-maintained, with a sign out front that made its identity clear. This was a place where faith and conservative politics weren't just compatible, they were inseparable. The pastor who led this congregation wasn't some quiet, behind-the-scenes figure. He was charismatic, confident, the kind of speaker who could hold a room's attention without effort. He preached with authority, with certainty, with the kind of conviction that makes people believe they're hearing absolute truth. And his message was consistent. Traditional values, strong families, biblical gender roles. The culture war was real, and his church was on the front lines. America was losing its way, and only a return to godly principles could save it. He wasn't subtle about his political alignments. Red hats appeared in the pews. Campaign slogans made their way into sermons. The congregation wasn't just a religious community. It was a political one, united by a shared vision of what America should be, and the pastor was their leader, not just spiritually, but culturally. He was invited to speak at rallies, he appeared in podcasts, he built a social media following that extended far beyond his congregation. He was becoming a brand. But brands need to be protected, images need to be managed, and nothing threatens a pastor's authority quite like being single when you're preaching about the importance of marriage. The congregation noticed, not in a critical way, not at first, but in that way that church communities do, where concern gets expressed as prayer requests and gentle questions. When would he find someone? Didn't he want a family? Wasn't he lonely? The pressure was subtle but real. A pastor without a wife is incomplete in the eyes of many congregations, especially a pastor who speaks so passionately about family values. It creates a kind of credibility gap. How can you teach what you haven't lived? So when he announced his engagement, the response was overwhelming, not just happiness but relief. Their pastor was finally becoming the complete package, the full picture of godly manhood, a leader in every sense. But what no one was asking was the question that mattered most. Who was this woman he'd chosen to marry? And was she ready for what was about to happen to her life? She wasn't from his world, at least not originally. She had her own life, her own career, her own identity before she met him. She attended the church, yes, but she wasn't embedded in its inner circle. She wasn't a pastor's kid raised in ministry. She was just someone who showed up on Sundays, who believed in the message, who found community there. And then the pastor noticed her. In any other context, we'd call this a whirlwind romance. But in church culture, especially in conservative evangelical circles, speed isn't necessarily a red flag. In fact, it's often encouraged. Date with purpose. Court with intention. Don't waste time. When you know, you know. So when their relationship went from introduction to engagement in a matter of months, people celebrated it. This was decisiveness. This was a man who knew what he wanted. This was God's timing. She was brought into the spotlight almost immediately, introduced to the congregation, praised from the pulpit, held up as an example of godly womanhood, the kind of woman who would stand beside a man of God and support his ministry. But here's what often gets missed in these situations. She wasn't just marrying a man. She was marrying a role, a set of expectations, an entire identity that had been prepared for her before she even said yes. Pastors' wives don't just exist, they perform. They smile at the right times, they counsel women in crisis, they organize events, they represent the church's values in every interaction. They become public property in a way that's difficult to understand unless you've lived it. And all of this happened fast. Too fast, maybe, for her to fully understand what she was signing up for. The engagement was short, the wedding was elaborate, the congregation showed up in force, filling every pew, celebrating what felt like their victory as much as the couple's. The ceremony was everything you'd expect. Traditional vows, biblical readings, a sermon about marriage that probably went longer than anyone wanted. And at the center of it all, a pastor and his bride, standing before God and hundreds of witnesses, promising forever. The photos looked perfect, the smiles looked genuine, the future looked bright. But perfect images have a way of hiding complicated truths. And the truth was, this marriage was starting under a kind of pressure that most relationships never face. The pressure to represent something larger than themselves. The pressure to be an example. The pressure to never, ever fail publicly. And they had an audience watching for any sign of cracks.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.
The first few weeks were probably fine. Honeymoon phase, newlywed bliss, the excitement of building a life together. But somewhere in those early months, something shifted. She started noticing things. Small things at first. Absences that didn't quite add up. Explanations that felt rehearsed. A phone that was suddenly password protected when it hadn't been before. Late nights that were blamed on ministry obligations. In any normal relationship, you'd ask questions. You'd express concerns. You'd have conversations about trust and transparency. But this wasn't a normal relationship. This was a marriage under a microscope, with an entire congregation invested in its success. And there's something else. When you're married to a pastor, questioning him feels like questioning God's anointed. There's a spiritual hierarchy at play that makes it difficult to assert yourself. Submission isn't just a preference, it's a doctrine. Wives are taught to respect their husbands as the spiritual head of the household. To challenge that is to challenge the natural order. So maybe she stayed quiet at first. Maybe she tried to convince herself that everything was fine. Maybe she prayed about it, the way she'd been taught to handle every problem. Maybe she talked to a friend, tested the waters to see if her concerns were valid or if she was just being paranoid. But the patterns continued, the distance grew, and the feeling that something was deeply wrong became impossible to ignore. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being married to someone who's always performing. Someone whose public persona is so carefully managed that you start to wonder if you ever see the real person. Someone who can preach about intimacy and vulnerability on Sunday and then be completely closed off at home. And when you're in that position, isolated by expectations and reputation, it's incredibly difficult to know who to turn to. The church leadership? They're his colleagues, his friends, his supporters. The congregation? They've invested in this marriage as proof that their pastor is the real deal. Your family? They might not understand the unique pressures of ministry life. So you stay quiet. You manage. You perform your role as the supportive wife, while everything inside you is screaming that something is wrong. Until you can't stay quiet anymore. Until you find something that makes silence impossible. What she found, she claims, was evidence of infidelity. The exact details don't matter as much as what they represented. Betrayal at the most fundamental level. Not just broken vows, but broken trust. Not just one mistake, but a pattern. Not just a moment of weakness, but allegedly deliberate deception. 4 months. They had been married for 4 months. Think about that timeline. Most couples are still in the phase where they're learning each other's morning routines, still figuring out whose family to visit for holidays, still in that period where marriage feels new and fragile and full of possibility. And she was allegedly discovering that her husband, the man who stood in front of hundreds of people every week teaching about faithfulness, was being unfaithful to her. The emotional devastation of that discovery is hard to overstate. It's not just the betrayal itself, though that's enormous. It's the context. She had given up her autonomy to marry him. She had taken on a public role she never asked for. She had subjected herself to scrutiny and expectations that most people never face. She had trusted him with everything, and according to her claims, he had been lying from the start, or at least from very early on, which raises the question, was the marriage ever real? Was she ever anything more than a prop in his carefully constructed image? These are the kinds of questions that break people, that shatter not just relationships but entire belief systems. Because if your pastor husband, who teaches biblical truth every Sunday, can look you in the eye and lie, what else isn't true? What else is performance? But beyond the personal devastation, there was a strategic calculation she had to make. What do you do with information like this when you're not just a wife, you're a pastor's wife? When your marriage isn't just your business, it's the business of an entire congregation. The traditional advice would be clear: handle it privately. Go to counseling. Pray about it. Give him a chance to repent. Protect the ministry. Don't cause a scandal. Remember that you're representing something bigger than yourself. And that advice exists for a reason. It protects institutions. It maintains order. It prevents chaos. But it also protects abusers. It silences victims. It prioritizes image over truth. She had to decide what mattered more, the institution or her integrity, the church's reputation or her own story, his position or her pain. And she made a choice that would change everything. She decided to speak, not in a private meeting with church elders, not in a carefully mediated counseling session, not in a way that could be controlled or contained or spun into something more palatable. She went public with her allegations, and when she did, she didn't hold back. The details came out in a way that left no room for ambiguity. She wasn't vague. She wasn't diplomatic. She laid out what she claimed had happened, what she alleged she had discovered, and how the man presenting himself as a moral authority had allegedly failed at the most basic level of human decency. The response was immediate and divided. Some people believed her instantly, especially women who had their own stories, women who had seen behind the curtain of ministry life and recognized the patterns she was describing. Women who knew how easy it is for powerful men in religious spaces to hide their behavior behind spiritual language and institutional protection. But others reacted with outrage directed at her. How dare she attack a man of God? How dare she air private matters publicly? How dare she threaten the ministry? Didn't she understand the damage she was causing? Didn't she care about the gospel? This is the double bind that women in these situations face. If you stay quiet, you protect the institution but sacrifice yourself. If you speak up, you're accused of being vindictive, attention-seeking, or demon-influenced. There's no good option. There's no way to tell your story without being punished for it. And the punishment came swiftly. She was called divisive. She was accused of trying to destroy a good man's reputation. She was told she was being used by the enemy to attack God's work. She was blamed for causing confusion and hurt in the congregation. Never mind that she was allegedly the one who had been hurt. Never mind that she was allegedly the one who had been betrayed. Never mind that she was allegedly the one who had trusted someone who violated that trust in the most fundamental way. The narrative quickly became about her actions, not his. About her decision to go public, not his alleged decision to be unfaithful. About the damage she was causing, not the damage that had allegedly been done to her. This is how institutions protect themselves. Not by addressing the accusations, but by attacking the accuser. Not by investigating the claims, but by questioning the motives. Not by seeking truth, but by maintaining order. But here's what they couldn't control. Once the story was out, it took on a life of its own. Social media doesn't respect institutional boundaries. Information spreads, people talk, and suddenly, a congregation that thought it knew its pastor was confronted with a version of him they'd never seen before. Some defended him to the end, insisted the allegations couldn't be true, claimed she must be lying or exaggerating or misunderstanding, held onto the image they'd invested in. Others started asking questions, started remembering things that hadn't made sense at the time, started wondering if there had been other signs they'd missed or dismissed. And in the middle of all this chaos, all this public speculation and division and accusation, the pastor himself was notably quiet, until he wasn't. His response came in the form of legal papers. The pastor filed for divorce, not quietly, not after a period of attempted reconciliation, not after counseling or mediation, or any of the steps that his own sermons probably recommended. He filed for divorce immediately after the public allegations. And the timing of that decision is worth examining, because it does a few things strategically. First, it shifts the narrative. Instead of being the accused party responding to allegations of infidelity, he becomes someone ending a troubled marriage. It reframes the situation as mutual failure rather than one-sided betrayal. Second, it creates legal boundaries. Once divorce proceedings begin, there are limits on what can be said publicly without risking legal consequences. It's a way of containing the damage, of putting up walls that didn't exist before. Third, it sends a message to the congregation and to anyone watching. He's moving on. He's taking action. He's not going to be paralyzed by accusations. He's still in control. But what it doesn't do is answer the allegations. Filing for divorce isn't the same as addressing the claims. It's not a denial. It's not an explanation. It's not an apology. It's simply a legal maneuver that changes the playing field. And that ambiguity created its own problems, because people wanted answers. They wanted to know if the allegations were true. They wanted to know if their pastor had failed in the way she claimed. They wanted clarity. What they got was silence dressed up as action. The church itself was caught in an impossible position. How do you support your pastor without seeming to dismiss serious allegations? How do you maintain unity when your congregation is fundamentally divided on who to believe? How do you continue ministry when the foundation of trust has been cracked? Some churches would have demanded accountability, would have brought in outside investigators, would have created space for truth-telling and healing, would have insisted that leadership be held to the standards they preach. But that's not what happened here. Instead, there was circling of wagons, defense of the institution, protection of the brand. The ministry continued, services went on, and the message, implicit but clear, was that this was a private matter being handled appropriately and everyone should move on. Except you can't just move on from something like this. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't unring a bell. The divorce proceedings moved forward, quiet now, handled through lawyers, stripped of the public drama that had characterized the exposure, turned into paperwork and legal language and scheduled court dates. But the questions remained. The division remained. The hurt remained. And somewhere in all of this, there was a woman whose life had been completely upended, who had gone from newlywed to divorcee in a matter of months. who had lost not just a marriage, but a community, an identity, a vision of her future, and a pastor who had gone from respected leader to scandal, but who still had a pulpit and a congregation and a platform. The power imbalance that had existed in the marriage was now playing out in the divorce. This story isn't unique, it's a pattern. All across the country, in churches of every denomination and political leaning, versions of this story play out behind closed doors. Pastors who preach one thing and live another. Spouses who discover betrayal and face impossible choices. Congregations that prioritize reputation over truth. And there are specific dynamics in religious communities that make these situations particularly complex and particularly harmful. First, there's the issue of spiritual authority. When someone is positioned as God's representative, as a person with special access to divine truth, it becomes incredibly difficult to question them. Challenging a pastor isn't just disagreeing with a person, it's potentially disagreeing with God. That's a heavy burden to place on someone who's trying to process their own pain and betrayal. Second, there's the doctrine of submission that's taught in many conservative churches. Wives are instructed to submit to their husbands, to respect their leadership, to support their decisions. When that doctrine is misused, it creates an environment where abuse and betrayal can flourish unchecked. Where speaking up feels like sin, where suffering in silence is praised as godliness. Third, there's the isolation that comes with being a pastor's spouse. You can't talk to church members because they're your husband's congregation. You can't talk to other pastors because they're your husband's colleagues. You can't talk to counselors within the church system because they're loyal to the institution. Your support system is limited by the very role you're supposed to fulfill. And fourth, there's the massive pressure to maintain the image. Ministry families are constantly performing. Their marriages are held up as examples. Their children are watched. Their behavior is scrutinized. Any crack in the facade feels like failure, not just personally, but spiritually. So problems get hidden, issues get minimized, and by the time something breaks into public view, it's usually because the situation has become absolutely unsustainable. These dynamics create an environment where abuse can happen more easily and accountability can be avoided more effectively, where victims are silenced and perpetrators are protected, where institutions survive at the expense of individuals. And it's not just about infidelity, though that's what this particular story centers on. It's about financial abuse, emotional manipulation, spiritual coercion, physical violence, all of it hidden behind the language of faith and submission and protecting the ministry. There's been a reckoning happening in religious spaces over the past few years. Investigations into major denominations, exposure of systemic cover-ups, survivors finding their voices and demanding change. The conversation is finally shifting from protect the institution to believe survivors and create accountability. But change is slow, and for every person who speaks up, there are dozens more who stay silent, who calculate the cost and decide it's too high, who leave quietly rather than fight publicly, who carry their pain alone because the alternative feels impossible. This pastor's story is part of that larger pattern, and whether the specific allegations are proven true or not, the dynamics at play are real and damaging and far too common. So where are we now? The divorce proceedings continue, though details are scarce. Legal matters have a way of becoming quiet and procedural, stripped of the emotion that characterized the public exposure. There are lawyers involved now, mediators, judges. The messy human story gets translated into legal language and property division and custody arrangements, if there are any. The pastor is still leading his church, still preaching on Sundays, still maintaining his social media presence. His platform has been affected, certainly. Some followers fell away. Some supporters reconsidered. But he still has a congregation that shows up, that believes in him, that sees him as their spiritual leader. This is something that often surprises people outside of church culture. How resilient these systems are. How quickly communities can absorb scandal and keep functioning. How easily cognitive dissonance gets managed when belief is at stake. If you've invested years in a church, if you've built your identity around its teachings, if your friends and family are all connected to that community, Walking away is extraordinarily difficult. It's easier to doubt the accuser than to question the foundation. As for her, she's largely disappeared from public view, which makes sense. She's gone through something traumatic, something that played out in front of an audience, and now she's trying to rebuild a life that got completely demolished. She's dealing with divorce, loss of community, loss of identity, the aftermath of being disbelieved and attacked by people who claim to care about her. There's no roadmap for recovering from something like this, no guidebook for what to do when your marriage to a pastor implodes publicly and half the church decides you're the villain. She's figuring it out as she goes, probably with whatever support system she can cobble together outside the church that rejected her. The congregation itself remains divided, though openly discussing that division has likely become taboo. In functional communities, you can disagree and still maintain relationship. But in high-control religious environments, disagreement often equals disloyalty. So people learn to perform unity even when it doesn't exist. They smile at each other on Sundays while harboring completely different views about what happened and who to believe. And that's a kind of poison that seeps through everything. When you can't trust the leadership to tell the truth, how do you trust anything they teach? When you watch someone get vilified for speaking up, how do you feel safe speaking up yourself? When you see the institution protect itself at the expense of an individual, how do you believe that institution actually cares about you? Some people have left the church, quietly mostly, just stopped showing up, found other communities, or stopped attending church altogether. Their faith may have survived, but their trust in institutional religion didn't. Others stayed and doubled down, defended the pastor more vigorously, dismissed the allegations more firmly, created their own narrative where she was troubled, he was victimized, and the church persevered through attack. This is a psychological necessity for them. The alternative would require reconsidering too much. And there are probably people in the middle, uncertain and uncomfortable, going through the motions while internally wrestling with questions they don't know how to answer. As for the broader religious community in Atlanta and beyond, this story became one more data point in an ongoing conversation about leadership, accountability, and power. Some used it as an example of why reforms are needed. Others used it as an example of why you shouldn't air dirty laundry publicly. The lessons people drew depended entirely on what they needed to believe.
So what are we left with?
A marriage that lasted 4 months, allegations of betrayal, a public exposure, a divorce filing, and more questions than answers. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the discomfort of not having a neat resolution is exactly what makes this story worth examining. Because real life doesn't tie up neatly. Scandals don't come with satisfying conclusions where good is vindicated and evil is punished, and everyone learns a clear lesson. What we have instead is a mess. A human mess dressed up in religious language, but ultimately just about people failing each other in profound ways. About power being misused, about trust being broken, about institutions protecting themselves at the expense of individuals. And we have to sit with some difficult questions. Should church leaders be held to higher standards? Absolutely. They claim moral authority. They demand submission. They position themselves as examples. If that position comes with power and privilege, it should also come with accountability. But our current systems don't reliably provide that accountability. Too often, the very structures that should enable oversight instead enable cover-up. Was public exposure the only option? That's harder to answer. We'd like to believe that there are proper channels, that if she had just gone to the right people, handled it the right way, submitted to the right process, everything would have been handled justly. But the evidence from hundreds of similar cases suggests otherwise. Proper channels often protect the powerful, and by the time someone goes public, it's usually because every other avenue has been exhausted or feels too dangerous to try. Who really lost the most in this marriage? Both of them lost something. He lost reputation and credibility, though he retained his position and platform. She lost her marriage, her community, her identity as a pastor's wife, and probably her faith in the institution, if not her faith altogether. But let's be clear, the person with less power always loses more. The person whose voice is questioned always pays a higher price for speaking. These stories matter because they're not isolated incidents. They're symptoms of systemic problems. Problems with how we structure religious authority. Problems with how we treat women in faith communities. Problems with how we prioritize image over truth. Problems with how we handle failure in people we've positioned as spiritual leaders. And until we're willing to have honest conversations about those systemic issues, until we're willing to create real accountability for people in power, until we're willing to believe survivors even when it's inconvenient, until we're willing to value truth more than reputation, these stories will keep happening. Different names, different cities, different congregations, but the same pattern, the same power dynamics, the same betrayal, the same silence, and the same choice that every person in these situations has to make: protect the institution or tell the truth. She chose truth. And whether you believe her or not, whether you think she handled it correctly or not, that choice took courage, because she knew what it would cost. She knew she'd be attacked. She knew she'd lose her community. She knew the institution would survive, and she'd be the one left picking up the pieces. And she told her story anyway. That's worth something. Even if we never know exactly what happened behind closed doors, even if the legal proceedings end without clear resolution, even if half the people who hear this story decide she's lying, she refused to be silent. And in a system that depends on silence to function, that's a revolutionary act. This is a story about marriage, about power, about faith, about failure, about the gap between who we claim to be and who we actually are, about what happens when that gap becomes too wide to ignore. And it's a story that's still unfolding, because the questions it raises don't have easy answers. The systems it exposes don't change quickly. The hurt it reveals doesn't heal on a convenient timeline. But maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told. Not with neat resolution, not with satisfying endings, not with clear villains and heroes, but with honest complexity, with difficult questions, with recognition that faith communities can be both sources of genuine meaning and sites of profound harm, that leaders can teach truth on Sunday and live lies on Monday, that victims can be brave and still lose everything. This is the Atlanta MAGA church scandal, a story of a marriage that lasted 4 months and a fallout that will last much longer. A story about who gets believed, who gets blamed, who gets protected. A story about what happens when the image cracks and the reality underneath is uglier than anyone wanted to admit. And a story that asks all of us to consider what we value more: the comfort of maintaining appearances or the disruption of demanding truth. The answer to that question determines what kind of communities we build, what kind of leaders we empower, what kind of harm we're willing to overlook in service of something we've decided is more important. And that's not just a question for churches, that's a question for all of us.
If you want to uncover more chilling true crime stories and see justice exposed, subscribe to Crime Vaults as we bring light to the darkest true crime cases and never miss the secrets hidden in plain sight.